Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll get started here. I know we have a few people, a number of people that are still to join, but we'll begin. So let me begin by saying good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another round of the Green Building Professional Seminar Series. Just for your information, this event will be, I'm just making sure, this event will be recorded. And posted on our website so that you can share with your colleagues or go back and rewatch if you miss it. Everyone should be muted upon entry. And please stay on mute until we get to the question and answer session at the end. And then if you'd like to unmute yourself, you're welcome to. You can put in a request in the chat box and I can call on you. Or if no one's speaking, you can just go ahead and unmute yourself. During the presentations, if you have a question, feel free to use the chat box. If you're more comfortable using the chat box in the Q&A, you're welcome to do that, and we'll get to your questions. As for the agenda, you'll hear from our four panelists, and then we'll have the question and answer at the end. So I appreciate your patience during withholding your questions till we get to the end before they're answered. I think we have a great panel today. I know I say that every month, but I mean it this time as I do every time. But I think our panelists are really going to bring a lot of light on this issue. Today's event is Transforming Transportation Through Electrification, and it will look at the district's vision and goals for transitioning away from fossil fuels to zero-emission vehicles. As many of you may know, the Clean Energy DC Omnibus Amendment Act established for the first time targets and goals for the city to transition its fleet, but also private fleets and even residents into electric vehicles and zero emissions vehicles. The policy complements other transportation initiatives we already have ongoing, particularly the Move DC plan, which is the district's long-term transportation plan, which looks at trying to shift people away from single occupancy vehicles and driving to work or to the grocery store every day and into public transportation, walking, biking, and establishing the infrastructure that allows for people to do that safely, efficiently, and get around and get to the services they need. And then, so sometimes I say the goal is to drive less and electrify the rest. So where possible, take public transport and walk, but we certainly still need vehicles. And so we try to electrify those or look for zero emission options. The Clean Energy DC Act will help us reduce our carbon emissions from transportation, which represents about a fourth of all of our citywide carbon emissions, which is significant. It'll also help reduce tailpipe pollution, which is a driver of respiratory problems such as asthma. And, a lot of our highways tend to go through some of our low-income communities, vulnerable communities. And so there's a real health impact that this has as well. To an extent, this shift to electric vehicles is already underway. Some of you probably have an electric vehicle or a hybrid plug-in. DC government is, I think, only really purchases now electric vehicles or electric vehicle plug-ins unless there's an exemption or there's not the technology doesn't allow for it. And with the circulator bus, we have one of the largest electric bus fleets on the East Coast. So there's a lot of good news to report, but of course there's still a lot of challenges ahead, and there's a lot of work and thinking to be done. It will require new infrastructure, people and businesses to adopt electric vehicles. It'll put new stress on the grid. It could impact the workforce or displace workers or require new training. And, if we don't think about it wisely and through an equity lens, it could have negative impacts on some of our residents who may not be able to afford electric vehicles, who may not be able to charge them in a single family home or have access to charging. So there's a lot of questions we still are working through and have to think about, which is why conversations like this are so important, to look at what we're currently doing, but also think, hey, what do we still need to do? Look at the perspective and what other cities and states and countries are doing. So the last thing I'll say before introducing our panelists is just let me thank our other sponsors. So Department of Regulatory and Consumer Affairs, the Mayor's Office, also Director Wells at DOE, and Dr. Lawrence, our Associate Director for Deputy Director for Energy, for supporting us. And I also want to recognize all my other colleagues in the DC government, most of which are still going to work every day. They've built 4 miles of new bike lanes during the pandemic, installed a lot of car-free roads for buses and bikes, and are supporting all the operations of the DC government from COVID response to elections to the inauguration. And so I just want to recognize them for all their hard work. So we're going to move on to the presentations now, and we'll start. Let me introduce the presenters in the order they'll speak. Eric Campbell is our electric vehicle program manager. Cameron Gorgonpour is the director of mobility solutions at NG Impact. We have Jennifer Grisham with us, who's the principal program manager for smart grid and technology at PEPCO, and Eric Campbell, who's the program manager for the circulator bus at DDOT, Department of Transportation in DC here. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this to my colleague Eric, who will give an overview of the current regulatory landscape for electric and zero emission vehicles in DC.
Thanks very much, Jamie, and good afternoon for folks, except some of you who may be calling in from the West Coast or Mountain Time, in which case I say good morning. Once again, as Jamie introduced, my name is Eric Campbell, and I am the program manager regarding electric vehicles and electric vehicle infrastructure here in the district on behalf of DOEE. My goal for this presentation is to sort of give a very, very brief, as I started my clock, 10 minutes on everything that's happening in the EV world. And but of course, at the end of the presentation, we're going to have chances for opportunities. And of course, I'll be more than happy to answer any questions offline as well via email or phone number, if that's still your thing. I'm going to share my screen now, and we will get this presentation underway. Okay. So as Jamie mentioned in the first part of his introductory, a lot of our overall policy goals as well as programmatic goals actually take a nod from both the Clean Energy DC plan, which is the district plan to become carbon neutral by 2050, and the Clean Energy DC Omnibus Act of 2018, which sort of lays out the legal framework for how each of these plans are going to be implemented and provide different types of goals and guidance for them. Since Jamie thankfully managed to touch on the first two subjects, I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit so we can dive into the juicy part. For those of you who have not seen this, you can pretty easily Google CEDC or Clean Energy DC, the plan and goals, and that will come right up. But just to give everyone a overview of it, it's the overall the district goal guide for and its first sort of roadmap on how we are going to achieve our sustainable goals and to reduce emissions by 50%, reduce carbon emissions by 50%, increase the amount of renewable energy capacity by 50%. And in order to meet some of those goals, we've identified certain sectors within the district where these greenhouse gas emissions are coming from. And outside of buildings, the transportation sector actually is one of the highest sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And so in our plan, we've laid out different types of policies and pathways in which we rely on how we can tackle reducing these types of emissions. So, and we have 13 different action items that exist within the transportation electrification space, which we'll get into. So the CEDC plan is one thing, and for the act, as Jamie sufficiently realized, it's sort of in Title V of the act. It gives the transportation emissions reductions and electrification, which mandates the district to find a way on how we can actually get to zero emission fleet for both our public bus system, which Eric, as he's formerly known as, or formerly known as now, Electric Eric, will give an idea on how we're handling that on our public bus system. But we also realize that we need to tackle our private fleets as well. If you are interested in more details of the Clean Energy DC Act, I can strongly recommend checking out the different issues just by Googling it, and I'll provide a link in the chat box after I'm done for more information. So within the Clean Energy DC Act, there is, in Title V, there's a section which both coordinates that the district shall create a mayor's transportation electrification plan and the clean vehicle transition plan. Now, both of those policies, plans, and programs are actually complementary to each other. And so we've combined them into what we like to call the Transportation Electrification Roadmap, or the TE Roadmap. And in its goals are three main categories. The first is to get buses and private fleets to switch over to 50% either low or zero emission vehicles by 2030, and to scale up in 5-year increments to 100% zero emission vehicles by 2045. The second goal is to have 100% EV replacements of public buses and school buses by end of life by 2021. Does it mean by 2021 we should have policy set in place for new buses that are coming online, especially school buses, to be electric replacement. And finally, the third goal is, in a very broad summary, that at least 25% of zero emission vehicles to be registered in the district by 2030. So if you were to hop over to DMV to the DMV website and ask how many light duty vehicles there are registered in the district, I can save you a trip and tell you that there's roughly over 300,000 light duty vehicles registered in the district. So based off this numbers, we're estimated that we need to increase the amount of EVs in the district up to 75,000 in order to meet this goal. So what we're hoping that the TE roadmap or the TER would produce is different types of policies, cost estimates, timeline, budgets, all the different types of knobs and levers and buttons you need to twist, pull, or push in order to achieve these goals. So how are we going along with this so far? Well, currently we compared the roadmap with different types of action items that we're taking from different cities and see on like which would be the best fit for DC. Such as Pittsburgh, San Francisco, Fort Collins, the Boston proposal, Austin, Texas, New York, and Columbus, Ohio. And we decided that a grant would be the proper action to go through. And in March of 2020, one of the good things that came out of March is we awarded a grant to the Electrification Coalition to start their work. And currently we're on track to have the entire roadmap presented to the mayor's office beginning of the next fiscal year in September or October. So what this roadmap is going to entail is in order to meet those different goals, but everything is how do we tackle charging in the district, what are the types of incentives that we are needed, and we are taking a very comprehensive look to really that this roadmap will provide the actual guidance we need in order to achieve this goal. But one of the most crucial parts about all this is actually we need stakeholders involved. We need some of the people who are involved in the decision, who live in the district, and we want them to in order to provide feedback. So at the end of the presentation, my email will be available, and I'll put it in the chat box side. If you are interested in joining us to provide feedback as we develop this roadmap, and then afterwards, we would love to have you on board. As I know I am the smartest person in this room, not including my dog or this bike behind me. So we can, but I definitely know there are some great ideas and influence that other people can offer, and we would love to have you part of our team. So that's kind of the brief of the roadmap that's currently in development to be hopefully to be presented to the mayor's office by the end of this fiscal year. But there are a few other parts of the CEDC Act that we are implementing to increase the amount of transportation electrification. The first one is that is set in section 501, 501. It's a vehicle excise tax, which is being implemented by the DMV with support of DOEE. And this is going to be a revenue neutral tax to incentivize more high efficiency vehicles, which is supposed to be released in the first quarter of this year. Basically, what the tax is trying to do is shall be you can read about this in the CEDC Act. It shall be higher for vehicles with a fuel efficiency lower than the benchmark standard which we established, and the tax rate should be lower or receive a rebate for vehicles with a fuel efficiency that is higher than the benchmark standard. Pretty much we're trying to equalize it, so if you have a lower efficiency vehicle, you have to end up paying more on the excise tax. All these different types of fuel efficiencies would be based on miles per gallon for the city versus highway, where you'll be able to coast behind a 18-wheeler safely, please. And some of you are wondering what the increase of the different types of TNCs, which I mean the Ubers and Lyft drivers that are circulating around our city. Well, we're actually encouraging them to produce their own greenhouse gas reduction plan to be presented to PSC, and the first plan should be submitted in February of 2022. So the clock is on for them. So these are some of the different the transportation electrification roadmap, the excise tax, and private vehicles, private reduction plan. Those are some of the different aspects in the transportation section of the CEDC Act. There are others, but with the limited time, we just wanted to highlight some of the big ones that we are currently working on. So what are some of the other aspects that are happening around the district that you may or may not know about? Well, one was we have finally gotten around to updating the 2017 DC Green Construction Code. Now we have adjusted some of the electives that are available for new or retrofit buildings. So if you're very curious, you can check out section A104.11.1 through 3, which are different electric vehicle charging infrastructure project electives that new or heavily retrofit buildings can implement to become LEED certified. All of them have to be based on the amount of installing electric vehicle infrastructure or supporting infrastructure in the parking garage that's associated with those buildings. For example, the infrastructure for at least one charging space per 10 parking spaces, but not less than 4 spaces. The second and third ones, you can expand the amount of for every 20 or every 10, but no less than 2 or 4 spaces entirely. If you have any, there are some additional precedents, and some of you who are maybe a little bit closer to the Legislative Office of DC are hearing about the new EV Readiness Act of 2020. That act is still under the process, but what it says that 20% of parking spaces should be EV ready or electric ready. However, that as much as I can comment it on this time being, since it's still ongoing, but also again in the chat box, I will provide a link where you can provide more information or to track to see on how the bill is doing over time. Speaking of time, I'm starting to run out of it, so I'm going to hurry along. Additionally, I want to give out a shout out to our DDOT colleagues who've been working very hard both during the pandemic and before that on curbside charging for rulemaking for the curbside charging. DDOT's rulemaking process for formalize the curbside charging permits, and in essence, what they're going to do is provide permits for electric vehicle supply equipment to be installed on the curb. In general, this is for every I want you to charge that if you are charging, if you are installed charging stations along the central business district by a vendor, that would leave for every 2 that is installed by the central business district, 7 has to be installed outside of the central business district to also make sure that you are including all of the 8 wards within the district. This is mostly our attempt to make sure that the charging stations are spread equitably throughout the district and not just focused on already highly utilized areas. For those of you who are concerned, each of these charging stations should not infringe on the right-of-way or the ROW, so that means any of the cable, the actual infrastructure setup itself should not impede into the sidewalk, any tree boxes or similar bike lanes. And especially for some of those homeowners who decide to install a charging station at their house and maybe strip it over a tree and hang it down or lay down a bunch of duct tape. The good news is that in the second version of this rulemaking, charging stations can also be installed and blocked with RPP, or residential parking permit restriction, which is good news for homeowners who live in areas with RPP restriction, who want to go for who want to switch over to electric but need more infrastructure put in place. This is one of the guidelines based on the amount of comments that we've received from everyone in the district, we decided to implement these changes. We're very excited for that to happen. For those of you who are wondering, we currently have over 100 different charging locations throughout the district. Most of them are level 2 charging stations located in different parking garages, Whole Foods, Walmart, and any other buildings that have parking lots associated with them. And then we're hoping that this rulemaking, as it goes forward and finalized, will be able to increase the amount of charging stations to help with the overall adoption process for folks who want to take the step to electric. As once you go electric, you never really do want to go back. If you are interested in checking out more of the proposed rulemaking, the link is located here, but also make sure to include it in the chat box on the side. That wraps up my 10.5 minutes that I managed to go forward. So I will be happy to take any questions after after all of our presenters go through. I'll also in the chat box on the side post some of those links, as well as my email address. So please reach out to me if you are interested in joining for the Transportation Electrification Roadmap Stakeholder Group. Jamie, I'm going to pass it back on to you.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you for your diligent time management, self-time management. It's always appreciated. Okay, so I think what we'll do now is just zoom out a little. Eric gave a great perspective of what's going on in DC, but we'll hear from Cameron, who has a national and international perspective, and he can tell us a little about some of the things he's doing.
All right, thanks. Let me bring up my screen here. All right. Can everyone see my screen?
It's working. Yep.
Okay, great. So, hi everyone. My name is Cameron Gorgonpour. I am Director of Mobility Solutions for NG Impact. I'll give some of the highlights on mobility for NG Group in a moment, but just to say that NG is an international energy company based in France, known pretty well around the world for our rather aggressive efforts to decarbonize energy production within our portfolio. So to that end, we're the largest independent power producer in the world and have made tremendous investments globally in renewable energy production. And as I'll discuss in a moment, we have a lot of work going on in the mobility space, especially around electric mobility. But just to take a moment about myself, I've been with NG for just under a year now. I guess I started in April of last year. And prior to that, I led the global electric mobility portfolio for the World Resources Institute. And prior to that, I was an Obama appointee for about 7 years, assigned to the Defense Department, where I created and ran the military's electric vehicle program focused on non-tactical vehicles on military bases here in the United States. And so I've been doing this for a while. I have looked across the country and around the world at a range of different electric vehicle technologies and policies. And so the information in this briefing is pretty high level, but it is largely my perspective on where DC fits in and things that I think that DC should be thinking about moving forward. I should also note that I've been a DC resident for about 13 years now, and I own an electric car. And so I couldn't help, as I was building these slides, to basically give my color commentary on the customer experience, the residents' experience living in one of these high-rise buildings, trying to operate an electric car in the district and around the district. So as I go through, just I have opinions. But anyhow, so I also have to give one caveat here, which is that this picture is not of DC. Some similarities, but not quite. So about NG. So I reside in NG Impact, which is the business unit within the company that is a consultancy. So we help public and private sector clients develop and then implement plans around really facilitating the transition to zero emission transport. Obviously, other folks with an energy impact work on other energy topics, but for me, it's about really enabling and facilitating this movement to zero emission transport, which at this point in time largely deals with electric mobility. Obviously, we have a strong interest in hydrogen as well, just based on what's commercially available in mass today and in the near future. A lot of our work tends to focus on e-mobility. As a company, again, to broaden out, we are the second largest provider of charging stations in the world, and that's primarily because we own EVBox, which is a very large charging station company. And our EVBox is going public soon, so there will not be a wholly owned part of ENGIE for much longer, but we'll still retain a large stake in the company. And you can see some of the stats, and these are actually, I mean, this changes every day, but we're in the gigawatts of power provided to charge EVs around the world, 75,000 installed charging stations globally. Again, that number is probably dated at this point. We also do a lot of energy management services to help ensure for all manner of customers, but for the purposes of this conversation, those clients that are operating charging networks understand the appropriate rates and have the right optimized use of vehicles. Again, we do this all over the world. So 55 or more countries at this point have worked with ENGIE and its different business units in designing and implementing electric vehicle charging solutions. So again, in a nutshell, ENGIE's awesome. You should all want to talk to us and work with us, but we actually do a lot around the world to make this transition. And I should say, as ENGIE Impact, as the consulting arm, probably my primary motivation for wanting to work for ENGIE Impact is that we do consulting, but it's consulting with an eye towards implementation. So we don't produce glossy reports alone. We produce glossy reports that actually have business models, financing, if needed, hardware, software, actual implementation capability on the back end. So that's about us. So a little bit about the state of electrification and transport today. And this is about the US, but I could provide the exact same outlook for really anywhere in the world. And here's what we know. So on the left, it's pretty clear that mass adoption of EVs is an inevitability. And it's really about how fast are we going to get there more than whether or not it's going to happen. And what we know, so this chart is from the US Energy Information Agency, which tends to be very conservative in their projections. And what I like about this is it shows how those projections change year after year after year. And pretty much every single year, the forecast is upwardly revised that EV adoption is going to accelerate. And we see this in the market too, that more and more electric vehicle models are being announced by major OEMs. We're getting a rapid exponential uptick in EV adoption, even though obviously the pandemic has slowed overall vehicle purchases. We see things like in China, where overall vehicle purchases have declined, but EV purchases have skyrocketed and continue to skyrocket. So we should all be very, very focused on continuing this momentum. So certainly I wouldn't say that we should just rest on our laurels and sit back and wait for the transformation to happen. But I think it's pretty clear that we have the momentum, that the folks that have been working on this for years on the public sector side, affecting policy, and now on the private sector side, really developing the technologies and commercializing, are winning. And so we should be happy about that, but also obviously not take our foot off the pedal. Now, on the right-hand side is the consequence of success. And that's a lot of what I want to talk about today, is that when we think about mass adoption of electrification, of electrified transport, that has a pretty significant impact on infrastructure. So this image is for the city of Sacramento, California. It's a pretty common one, widely circulated, so you might have seen this in other places. This is from 2017. And they did an estimate just based off of their anticipated growth in EV adoption at the time. How would this affect grid infrastructure within their city limits? And what you see is a tremendous impending impact. In this case, they're looking at distribution transformers. At what point are they going to need to just change out just that one thing, distribution transformers within the city? And it ends up being, based on these estimates, which again is years old and is probably upwardly revised at this point, it was something like an $80 million investment just in that one city, just to upgrade distribution transformers to allow for charging of their anticipated growth in private EVs. This doesn't even account, I don't believe, for public transit and other types of EV fleets. And so what happens as you start accelerating adoption, and boy, I sure hope we can beat that 25% target that you guys have by 2030 in DC. But what's going to happen is you're going to see a tremendous impact on need for upgrading electrical infrastructure in the city, and it's not going to be evenly distributed. And so keeping an eye on that, and how do we really plan for success? And this is something I talk about a lot because, again, looking all over the world, again, with the exception of China, I see this as something that's often missed, is that we're so focused on getting off the ground, getting people to adopt EVs, that a lot of times we can forget that what happens if we win is, and in this case, what happens when we win, because it's near certain that we're going to win on this. What happens? What happens if it's 30, 40% adoption by 2030 within DC? Really, I think that's an important exercise to go through, and hopefully you guys are already doing that type of work. But it really needs to be examined. And from our view, and I'll spend some time talking about this later in the deck, the coordinated development of charging infrastructure is really paramount to success. And by coordinated, I mean by crossing boundaries within city organizations and private sector stakeholders and civil society to look at not just how we're going to accelerate adoption, but where is that adoption going to occur? And can we coordinate with the infrastructure build out to make sure that these things are happening in tandem, and hopefully to reinforce more sustainable behaviors over time. So this is sort of the DC residents, EV owners' view of what's happening in DC today. And Eric, I think, kind of captured a good amount of this in his slides, but maybe I can just add a little bit from, again, just a DC resident's perspective, that when I went to buy an EV, I found the EV sales tax exemption to be helpful, certainly lower the price. I also found that the dealers either knew nothing or were just straight up lying to me about how federal tax credits were applied and what was the relevance of the DC tax exemption. I actually had to be educating dealers because I'm in a position to do that. But a nominal person walking into a dealership is really at the mercy of what dealers know, don't know, or are willing to share about these incentive structures. And so really public information and making sure folks understand what opportunities are out there is critically important. And for me, living in one of these high-rise buildings where I have a parking spot, but there's no charging infrastructure there, I looked at what the charging incentives are. They seem reasonable to me in the moment, but for somebody who needs to go out and charge with public charging stations, found that the experience was severely limited. Let's just say that you can see on the right. This is just off the FlagShare app. I did this yesterday, did a screen capture, and you can just see how it lays out that the vast majority of these charging stations are concentrated right downtown Capitol Hill area. They are behind what I call paywalls, because you have to pay $20 or so just to go park, and then sometimes the charging is free, but often not. So you're paying $20 to go park, and then you got to pay on top of that, which is fine if you're already going to pay for parking anyway. But if you're a person who just needs to charge your car, it's just not financially reasonable to do that. Now, over the past several months, the Whole Foods and the Giants have opened up some charging stations that if you go buy groceries, you can charge. That's cool, but it's still a paywall, and it's still not really accessible to folks that might not have the financial means to go and do that, once a week or a couple times a week. And I put there may be no functional curbside charging stations. I'm aware of exactly one curbside charging station in DC, and that's right in front of the Reeves building. and that has not been operable for probably about a year. There was construction there, which is good because there was construction to improve bike lanes and access to the buses. But at the same time, it decommissioned the one curbside charging station in the district that I'm aware of. I was really happy to see what Eric was pointing out about the curbside policies. Again, I know that's super politically sensitive about maintaining right of way. So it's definitely not easy to put in place curbside charging, but it's imperative. And as folks start adopting, across the district, EVs, it's going to be more and more important. Right now, the way this is set up, it's really probably more beneficial for folks who are commuting into downtown than your typical DC resident. And then I'm going to finish on just these last 2 points on vehicle grid integration. This deals with the coordination of EV adoption with the build out of infrastructure. That we feel strongly that as you're starting to ramp up development of public charging infrastructure, that it ought to be aligned with clean energy objectives, commonly by coordinating charging rates and schedules, and in some cases locations, to enhance your ability to adopt renewable energy as a supply, or at least an offset to the charging that's occurring throughout the city. And then there's this concept of electric transportation demand management, which is that EV adoption is going to accelerate. So let's plan ahead and let's see if we can motivate transportation decisions by locating charging infrastructure and defining the types of infrastructure that can be located in different parts of the cities to promote more sustainable transportation choices. So can we use electrification of private vehicles and knowing the need for public charging to motivate people to park in certain places and then either walk, cycle, or take public transit. So that sort of thing. So on the vehicle grid integration piece with regard to clean energy, this is a graph from the International Renewable Energy Agency published in 2019, where they looked at not just the reduction in CO2 emissions, but the potential to reduce unit cost of different types of renewable energy by integrating in different ways with vehicles. And what they found was that if you do, they're calling V1G is basically managed charging. So you control the time and the rate of charging electric vehicles to optimize for when renewable energy is available. So it's unidirectional charging to the vehicle, but carefully coordinated. Then you can actually reduce CO2 emissions and improve, especially for wind, the overall short-run marginal cost of renewables. Now, if you go to full vehicle to grid, which means that you're truly using the electric vehicle as an energy asset, so you can discharge energy from the vehicle to the grid and receive electricity from the grid, then you get tremendous CO2 reductions and cost savings on renewables. It also creates financial opportunity for the EV owners and for the facility operators. Now, luckily for DC, Pepco funded one of the very first vehicle to grid demonstrations in the world at the University of Delaware. And they were also a close partner of my work when I worked for the U.S. Defense Department, implementing a vehicle to grid project in Maryland at Joint Base Andrews. So you have the know-how here with your utility. Obviously, it needs to some development. There's policy, there's regulation, technical standards, some technology development, but it's mostly in hand at this point. And then really understanding how you operationalize this in the real world. And then I'll end on this, which is just to say on what we're calling ETDM, that accelerated EV adoption is underway. It's going to happen. You know that's going to create a crush of demand for public charging infrastructure over the next decade, certainly. So how we define city plans through transportation demand management through the lens of electrification, we think can actually enable more sustainable transportation behaviors. So again, that deals with how you site charging stations, where and how you permit, what types of charging stations will you allow in different parts of the city. There's such a focus on fast charging, but that might not actually promote the most sustainable behaviors within the city. You might actually prefer more ubiquitous AC charging stations so that people are parked for longer periods of time and may be more motivated to shift to alternate modes of transport. So thinking through those problems, integrating with your public transit plans, because it's common for public transit agencies to face infrastructure challenges when you get to high levels of adoption, thinking primarily about electric buses. But the same can be true for electrification of shared transport, taxis, TNCs. Looking at the financial incentives and disincentives for public charging to help motivate people to charge in different places at different times. And then, as Eric mentioned in his deck, really focusing on developing that infrastructure to ensure equitable access to zero emission transportation, again, for private vehicles and for public transit as it transitions to full zero emission. So I was really happy to see the curbside piece and how there's at least a draft policy working its way through that will essentially ensure that there's a broader deployment of curbside charging. So the upshot of all of this is that what we commonly perceive as barriers to EV adoption can really be enablers to systemic improvement. And we would hope, and we're certainly as a company ready to support DC and anyone else that really wants to take a deep dive into how we might do that. How do we actually construct sensible policies that get to the full sustainable mobility portfolio of avoid, shift, and improve, instead of just looking at electric vehicles as the improved part of that mantra. So with that, I'll end. By the way, I saw that there was a question came in for me for where I bought my EV. I bought it down in Maryland, in Suitland. So in any case, well, thank you all very much again. Happy to answer questions later and appreciate the opportunity to be here with you guys today.
Thank you, Cameron. That was a great presentation. And I knew you were going to give us the sort of national and international perspective, but I didn't know you were a resident and EV owner, and giving us that perspective. We're always serving our residents, so we appreciate it.
I was building the slides. I know we talked about it, but as I was building the slides, I'm like, wait, I actually have opinions about this. I'm sorry that's
I mean, that's what we need. We need feedback from people that have actually, I don't want to say piloting, but you have the EV car, you have experience, you have lessons that we need to take into account as we try to do this. So it's really valuable.
Yeah. Thank you.
And so with that, let me turn into another EV expert, Jennifer Grisham from Pepco, to talk a little bit about electric vehicles from the utility perspective, and hear from them. Jennifer.
Hi, everyone. Jennifer Grisham here. Before I bring my slide up, I'm just going to say really quickly, I'll do a quick intro, and I'm going to be talking through my cell phone just to make sure that I've got a pretty stable connection, unfortunately, this day and age. But I'm going to stop my video now. Okay, can you all see my screen now?
I think so. It's loading. Yep.
Okay, perfect.
Looks
All right.
good.
Again, I hope everyone here is very healthy and safe during these trying times. And thank you for inviting me to speak here today. Again, I'm the Principal Program Manager for our Smart Grid and Technology team here at Pepco. I think most people know about Pepco, but just a few quick facts. We are an electric distribution company, part of the Exelon family of utilities. We operate in the District of Columbia as well as Maryland suburbs, and we provide service to nearly 2.5 million people across the metro area. Okay. So as states across the country have begun developing their transportation electrification policies and goals, utilities have really emerged as a critical stakeholder and resource to help get these plans off the ground. There are really 4 components of utilities, strengths that have been critical and very important to help these programs. One, first, managing the charging load. I think we'll talk about that more in depth later, but it's definitely something I think that Cameron and Eric have also mentioned. Our top priority is to make sure that we're providing safe and reliable power, and we need to make sure that with the adoption of electric vehicles and the charging that's going to be going on, that we can do that properly. The second is utilizing utility rate options. Just to help maximize fuel savings, to help encourage customers to charge during off-peak hours so that we can help protect the grid and reduce costs associated with upgrades due to electric vehicle charging. Also, enhancing charging infrastructure. That's something I'll talk about in the next slide, a program that we have going on right now in the District of Columbia. And then finally, customer education. So just customer education in general for energy efficiency as well as electric vehicles has been a huge component of what utilities can offer. I'll say that we've had to modify our approach over the last 9 months due to the pandemic. We used to do more in-person type of outreach, grassroots events, and due to social distancing restrictions, we've had to modify that. Not just Pepco, but utilities in general, moving to more social media and also webinars such as this to help reach customers and help educate them about how EVs work and how to charge their vehicles. So talk about the programs that we have. We actually, our Exelon PHI family has got programs in Maryland, Delaware, and the District of Columbia, and hopefully soon one in New Jersey too. But in Pepco, our program really focuses on two different sectors. One being the residential area, where we have a time of use rate to help encourage customers to charge during off-peak hours. Off-peak hours being any time outside of Monday through Friday from noon to 8 p.m. Customers who charge their vehicles during those off-peak hours will get a reduced rate to help encourage and incentivize them from charging during times where our grid is most impacted. And then we also have an optional green adder, we call it the Green Rider, that provides for an additional cost 100% of renewable energy sources for those customers. And then the other sector that we have our program for is commercial and public. We are providing make-ready infrastructure in the city for public charging, taxi and rideshare, and then also bus depot and an en-route charger. I'm happy to say that at the end of last year, we did finish our first public charging make-ready deployment. We have two giants in the city, one on Alabama Avenue in Southeast, and then one in Park Road, where there are two level 2 charging stations. So we're really happy to be able to help deploy EV charging, especially in the underserved areas across the river. And Cameron mentioned it, but I do have to say that the charging vendor that's operating those charging stations does not charge. So that's great, I think, resource for district customers who can charge their vehicles at no to low cost. So we've seen, a huge surge of plug-in vehicle demand over the last 5 years. When we first started developing this program back in 2018, I think there were approximately about 1,500 light-duty vehicles registered in the city, and that's more than doubled in 2 years. And, it would have been higher, I'm sure, without the pandemic. And not only has light-duty residential usage increased over the last few years, but, we're expecting significant increase with bus charging and other medium and heavy-duty vehicles. Eric mentioned earlier, new retrofitting codes and just other programs that the city is going to be introducing that we know will help increase adoption of electric vehicles. So all of this really begs the question of what's the best way, to determine the impact that charging is going to have on our distribution grid. As Cameron noted in the California example, it can be extremely expensive planning for this. Proper planning is really critical to help deploy this. And this is something that almost all utilities are really thinking about at this time, particularly what's the best way to conduct this evaluation. And when utilities first start examining the potential load of EV charging, so the tendency is to focus on, those personal use light-duty vehicles, and then to examine that loading in aggregate form, and then uniformly spreading that load across the entire service territory, and then they compare the distributed load to their peak system. And this really doesn't give a full picture of what kind of impact we're going to be seeing next year or 2 years from now or 5 years from now. Transportation electrification is, as we know, it's more than just light-duty vehicles. We've got buses, medium delivery vehicles, rails, forklifts, and then also heavy-duty vehicles, which are all going to be part of the transition. And then, the charging loads for these vehicles tend to cluster at depots or group together, at workplace charging or, parking structures. And then finally, as these vehicles start, evolving into longer range, more powerful batteries, the chargers will as well. I think we're starting to see a lot more 100 and 150 kilowatt fast chargers, and there's also potential to even have faster chargers of 350 kilowatt systems. So we need to think about a more comprehensive approach rather than just looking at the light duty vehicle sector. So PEPCO has done, a lot of thinking. We've worked with some experts in the field about what's the best way, what's the more comprehensive way to go about determining what impact EV charging will have on our system. So we've come up with a bit different methodology than the one that I just described. One is identifying and mapping current utility substations into a specified territory. Then locating the maps and linking the facilities likely to install charging stations or clustered pockets of growth into those substations. And then we estimate the EV charger load growth on those new facilities and then map the expected load growth to individual substations. And then finally, we can assess the impact on those substations from the EV charger growth and what will that electrification growth look like for us, okay? And this process really helps allow us, to identify and link localized growth to specific substations and feeders. And that's really critical going forward, not to just assume that EV growth will be uniformly spread across the city. I think it was Eric previously showed a map that really showed the clusters, especially in Ward 6, the Capitol Hill area, Ward 3, the downtown business district of where EV charging is going to occur. Can everyone hear me? I just saw a message that they've lost sound.
I can hear you, Jennifer.
Okay, perfect. Finally, also this assessment will allow us to satisfy, this first step in meeting infrastructure challenges that transportation electrification brings. And then I think most importantly, it's going to provide us with that independent data that allow us to work with utility commissions and also DEOEE on their electrification mapping plan to help ensure that we can, seamlessly integrate the expected electrification into our current system and future system. So with that, I know I rushed through this. I wanted to make sure that we had enough time. I have my contact information here, and if there are any other questions, feel free to reach out or send it in the chat.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.
As the utility, you're obviously will be one of our closest partners on all of this. And so we're all getting some questions, but I'm going to pause those and move to my colleague, Eric from DDOT. And I think, Jennifer, you might still be sharing your screen. Eric might be able to override you, but Eric is going to give us a presentation on the circulator, which today's trivia question was, how many circulator buses are electric? I didn't get any responses, and you're about to find out that answer, though, from Eric.
All right, thank you, Jamie. Afternoon, everybody. My name is Eric Belmont. I am a program analyst at the District Department of Transportation. My division oversees the DC streetcar and, of course, the DC circulator bus system. And my role there is to oversee our bus electrification initiative. And today I'm going to be talking to you about how our program started for a transition to electric buses, where we are right now, and where we're going. But first, a shameless plug. Our system, DC Circulator, has 6 routes. We're the 4th largest in the region. We have high frequency service. It's cheap to ride our buses. and you can charge your phones and access the internet. And we have, as of 2017, had about 5 million trips a year. Our small fleet of 72 vehicles is small but mighty. We're very proud of it, and I encourage you to ride it safely during these troubled times, but afterwards, really encourage you to try commuting on it. We're very proud of it. So where did our electric bus program start? The genesis of the program started in July of 2017 with the purchase of 14 Proterra battery electric chargers at approximately $1 million per bus. That was able to happen through a combination of factors. One was political will from the mayor. This was seen as the first step in accomplishing the Sustainability 2.0 goals of reducing transportation greenhouse gas emissions by 60% and increasing transit use by 50%. But not just the mayor was a factor, the support from the private and public stakeholders in the area was crucial, especially the business improvement districts and groups such as the Sierra Club. So combination of support from all sectors allowed us to get it off the ground. I mentioned we bought the buses in 2017. They arrived in the summer of 2018, and we started what we're turning into a multi-year pilot to assess their capabilities and compare their performance to diesels. So there is a lot happening in this chart, but I show this to you.
Eric, let me just stop you and say your presentation isn't, I am not seeing your presentation.
Can't see it at all.
No. But it looks so seamless. I thought you were just going to talk, so you're doing a great job.
Uh-oh. The share content option is frozen for some reason on my end.
Okay.
Hang on one second. Can you see it now?
Yep.
All right. Well, I'm glad you all felt like that was what I was supposed to be doing. See, here's the Genesis slide I was telling you about. Pictures of the arrival of our very first bus. So exciting. This is the chart I was talking about. Again, there's a lot happening here, but I wanted to share this with all of you to emphasize that this is really a watershed moment for our program. This year specifically will see the launch of several projects within our department that, for one of them, will lead to the tripling of our electric fleet. Another, a retrofit of our existing electric facility and increase sophistication around its use. And also, we'll be announcing in the next months a new route to Ward 7, which will be our first 100% electrified route when it launches in 2022. And this year we'll be completing our DC circulator sustainability plan. That will be our roadmap to getting to 100% electric. So a lot is happening this year, and I wanted to make sure you knew about it. So let me go into a little more detail here. I mentioned our pilot. We had hoped to release the findings from our electric bus pilot last summer specifically, but 2020 was a complicated year for all of us, and it really caused us a lot of challenges with completing our data collection on the program. I'm happy to report that we will be releasing our findings in the spring of this year in the form of a final report, and I'll likely be presenting on that and sharing our findings. But there will be a report made available for viewing. And this is really going to be not just talking about the performance of the buses, but we'll be looking at what lessons we learned along the way. If anybody has seen me give a presentation on this already, there's a lot to learn and a lot of lessons that I think any transit provider needs to understand before transitioning to 100% electric. the DC Circulator Sustainability Plan. This is something I'm personally very excited about. We have selected a consultant who will start drafting this plan in the spring of this year, and we're planning to have a final version by the end of 2021. And this plan is going to be looking at 4 different pillars of our electrification program. First, resilience and sustainability. You know, we are very painfully aware of how vulnerable a 100% electric transit system can be to outages. So we'll be examining what can be done in our infrastructure and in our relationship with PEPCO to reduce the impacts of outages in the system or major weather events. On the sustainability side, it goes hand in hand with resilience in that while we're making sure that we can resist major outages and weather them, we're also looking at our carbon footprint. How do we cut down on our use of power from the grid and ensure that our footprint from sources is lower than it should be, than we'd like. Operations, another pillar. It's very different to run electric buses than diesels, so that's going to require some additional training of our staff, but also we may need to adjust our service patterns and our routes slightly. So this plan is going to take a comprehensive look at all of our routes and consider how do our schedules need to change? What else needs to be done to plan ahead for inclement weather or cold weather where batteries are perhaps less effective? Capital planning, we've got to buy more stuff. We need to figure out when it needs to happen. But we also need to make sure that we're making the right choices in terms of who is offering the best battery option and who has the best service from manufacturers of electric buses, but also when to phase out our diesel buses and make sure it's seamless. Finally, infrastructure, very complex part of this plan. We need to figure out not just what's going to be needed to electrify our facilities and prepare for a full electric fleet, but it's likely we will need to install on-route chargers throughout the city or auxiliary charging stations. So this plan will look at where the best options are to install those locations and how to incorporate them into our service planning. There are 2 major bus procurements happening this year. The first is a fleet expansion. We are just about to finalize our procurement of these 14 buses. These buses are slated to run exclusively on our new Ward 7 route and are expected to be delivered in 2022. The second procurement, also happening this year, will be our first electric bus procurement where we're replacing diesel buses with electrics. So we will be replacing 14 obsolescent diesel buses with 14 electrics and adding 2 spares to our fleet. And those are expected for delivery in 2022. Those buses combined with what we currently have, our current 14 buses, will increase our fleet size to 88 buses, and 50% of that fleet will be 100% electric. This is a high-level view of our current electric bus facility. It houses our 14 electric buses. We're currently finding a consultant to do a design for a complete retrofit of the facility, and we'll be starting our build later in 2022. We're adding 30 buses in the next 2 years. And this facility is only about 2.2 acres. Electric infrastructure takes up a lot of space. So in this design, we're going to be thinking about and incorporating concepts such as maximizing the space we have, but we're also going to be installing a microgrid and testing out a backup power system, but also a independent generation system on site to help us cut our utility use and reduce our carbon footprint. And this site's going to entail phased development. So I mentioned 2 different procurements. The first procurement in 2022 will need to be timed with the completion of a portion of the facility that will house those buses. And phase 2 for the facility will be completed in 2023 before the delivery of those buses. So this is a massive undertaking for us, and we'll fully electrify all of this facility. And finally, as exciting as retrofitting the facility will be, once those 30 electric buses arrive, that facility will be completely at capacity. So we've been searching for a permanent facility where the rest of our electric fleet can be housed, and we do anticipate that the fleet will continue to expand in the future as demand rises for circulator ridership. We think we have identified a suitable site for a permanent facility, but purchase and construction of that is some time off. However, that facility will be purpose-built for electric vehicles and incorporate what we've learned from our retrofit of our current facility and how we run it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric. So with that, we're done with the presentations. So I want to open the floor up. If anyone has any questions or comments that they would like to provide, having watched those presentations, you're welcome to do so now. You can do it directly in the chat, or I'm going to pause for a few seconds here and give someone the opportunity to unmute themselves and ask a question. Okay, while you think of questions, I will start with a question, and that is, and I think it could be for all of our presenters, but how should we be thinking about how the workforce fits into electric vehicles? And I'll start with you, Eric, and ask you, what issues have you had in terms of training your workforce? Have you found proper maintenance facilities for your workforce? But then I'll give our other presenters a chance to ask this question as well, because I think there's a lot of questions around if there's opportunities in terms of charging installations, if gas stations are at risk of being displaced, and if there's any, if you have any thoughts around how electrification will impact our workforce negatively or positively. But I'll start with you, Eric. Eric Belmont, to say.
Sure thing. Excuse me. That's a great question. I'll say for our part, one of the biggest impacts of having electric vehicles is on our maintenance crews. Our maintenance personnel are so familiar with diesel buses that there's been a steep learning curve for them when it comes to the electrics. And in part, that comes from the fact that so much of what controls an electric bus comes from software. That software is updated constantly by the manufacturer of the bus, but not just that, the electrical system itself is a completely different animal to a lot of these maintenance technicians. So we actually ended up having to, as part of our contract with Proterra, the bus provider, we paid to have an on-site technician from Proterra with us for at least 5 years. So that technician's still with us. And their job solely was to execute warranty claims, but also to train our technicians in the process of repairing our electric buses and becoming familiar with dealing with high voltage wiring. We went so far as to hand pick several technicians that seemed to grasp the technology fairly easily. And they actually had to go to Proterra's facility in South Carolina and sit down with their engineers to be able to ask questions and really get an in-depth understanding of how the buses work. But I think that transition for a lot of transit providers is going to take some extra training. And there may be an opportunity here where people with a background as electricians or electrical certifications could be trained on the maintenance side and bring their experience on the electrical side. So that may maybe open the door to a bigger workforce. But yeah, that was the biggest change for us.
To chime in again, just as somebody just trying to get his car fixed from time to time, I definitely see there's probably a pretty big need for how to be trained up to work on electric vehicles. It's really not very practical as an EV owner to have to go to the dealership when there are no dealerships in DC that would deal with an electric car. So I definitely see there's probably opportunity that will grow over time for DC-based technicians for sure. And then again, I mean, there's going to be a ton of infrastructure development, and so I would imagine that will lead to a lot of infrastructure-related jobs. I would bet.
Jamie, I'm going to echo Eric's comment. We've done, several installations in DC and Maryland, and having a steady number of electricians ready to support the installation as well as the ongoing maintenance Eric mentioned too. I think there's a huge opportunity moving forward for anyone interested in that industry. And it's funny, when you first asked the question, my first thought was our fleet too. PEPCO, like every other organization or most organizations, are looking to electrify their fleet, and it's a big learning curve for those of us who are, especially in the utility industry where people have been working 15, 20, 25 years to get into that mindset of driving EVs. So as Eric mentioned, electricians and electrical work is critical.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jennifer. I always think of PEPCO's role here as just the utility, but of course you have a lot of line trucks and a large fleet of vehicles yourself. So as you electrify those, you encounter the same fleet problems the rest of us encounter.
Yes.
So here's another question. There's it's around. We are obviously will have a new administration coming in. They've seemed to have been very pro electric vehicle, and they've even released a plan. There's also some COVID relief money that could be coming out of this. And I don't know if anyone wants to take this, but should cities be planning and developing budgets now to position themselves to access new funding, or how do you think the new administration could change and potentially catalyze the electric vehicle industry?
Well, I can take a crack at that. I mean, certainly the outlook looks a lot greater with the results from the Georgia runoff election. So I think it's pretty easy to imagine significant federal investment of infrastructure generally, transportation infrastructure generally, but the incoming administration has made very, very clear they want to very ambitious about the build out of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. I think you'll also see beefed up incentives and other type of federal programs to further accelerate EV adoption. So I think you're going to start to see a lot of that. I would advise any city to really think through, like, what's your wish list of things to take on, so that when funding opens up, you're prepared to pursue it. Also, here in the DC area, there's a lot of federal facilities. One of the things I think would probably be first off the line with the incoming administration is similar to work that I was doing in the Obama administration, which is to electrify the federal fleet. So you'll probably see federal facilities and moving in that direction, and along with their fleets. I would expect that to happen promptly with the incoming administration.
Thank you.
Jamie.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I wanted to echo, excuse me, what was just said. I think we're looking at an administration that tends to be much more EV friendly, and hopefully that will funding will come with that openness to EVs. But from a budget perspective, I think we have a complicating challenge here where many cities are heading into a time of austerity uh, because of a lack of federal support and shortfalls in budgets due to the pandemic. So I think on our part, it would be prudent to take a hope for the best outlook on federal funding and make that wish list for what's going to be wanted, but plan to work with what we have until we see what kind of federal relief will come for funding battery electric buses and transition on that side. The more funding we can receive, obviously, the faster the transition can be, especially on the facilities side. The buses themselves are quite fit. There's a lot of sticker shock up front on the capital side. And I can tell you from personal experience, when talking to other transit properties, general managers will balk at the cost. So any available federal funding that can make the buses more attractive for, I think, skeptical or local municipalities that simply don't have the capital to make that purchase, I think will really go a long way to this transition. But we need to see what direction this administration is going to go in and how aggressive they choose to be first.
I'm going to try to offer one more perspective. For folks who've been a fan of EVs or trying to become the futurist in all this, a long-standing target for the price of batteries has been estimated that by 2025, we'll be starting to see a similar price in terms of light-duty sedan between a ICE or internal combustion engine vehicle and an electric vehicle. I'm hopeful that the incoming administration would also be willing to continue their research in supporting and continue to bring those prices down. Anyone who's been following the battery wars over the past decade or so has been a very interesting sticking point in terms of both understanding on how globally that market competition has been, especially with the different type of proprietary technologies, and then locally as well. Always buy local if you can, but I can see that this next administration can provide more of a budgetary immediate relief, as well as smoothing out the transition towards purchasing the electric vehicle to make sure that we, no longer need the additional tax credit because the support of because support had brought down the price already. If anyone's ever interested to check to see what a full service EV like their first generation Leaf went for, and then the amount of technology leaps as well as technology leaps and price drops that happened over the past 3 years. It's quite fascinating. So I see that as not only as an immediate relief, but also a gradual relief as well.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Eric. And Eric, I might actually stick with you because we have another question from someone in the audience that says there will be 50 plus new electric vehicles that will be introduced by automakers. The greatest opportunity for electric vehicle charging in the district will be on street in parallel parking. What is the district proposing to meet demand for electric vehicle and plug-in electric vehicle charging in residential neighborhoods?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I believe, just to make sure I'm summarizing the question right, is what is the district planning to do with regards to not only the amount of vehicles that are being released, but on how to manage the charging that is going to come with it? Does that sound about right?
Yeah, the charging mainly in residential, on-street, and parallel parking spots.
Gotcha. First, I would always encourage people to make sure you keep your parallel parking skills up to date. As I have recently been trying to teach some younger folks on how to parallel park, and it's horrifying. That aside, the first aspect is based on my first instinct to respond to that is based on what we have taken an additional look at the DDOT rulemaking cases to open up the residential areas that had RPPs, residential parking permits, restrictions attached to them to make them available for charging stations to be installed in those locations to be able to receive a permit from a vendor to install them. I could see as we start to expand, the next big tackle would be the different types of residential areas in the district. So you're not just looking at the you're not only looking at single family homes, but the multi-unit dwellings to make sure that folks who have to drive as an absolute must have the necessary infrastructure to help support them. I would probably congratulate the work that the PEPCO has been doing along the side to make sure that that is an easier access point to engage in. I can also see that as we develop our charging plan as far as the transportation electrification roadmap, I would invite the person who did ask that question to feel free to email me. We would love to have this type of input to make sure that you are holding us accountable as we write these policies and budgets proposals. To make sure that the charging plan, to make sure that if we're trying to meet these goals, we need to understand what the type of our charging demands would be to make sure that we are matching that on a ubiquitous level. I can see if you were to look at different, I'm going to stop it after this one because I'm starting to ramble. If you look at the amount of like the NREL's EV Pro, they have an estimate that if you enter in the certain amount of electric vehicles that you want, what are the type of charging stations you would need. And I can also see that there would, as we are looking to increase the amount of EV charging stations, maybe at gas stations, not along curbside, to emphasize what Cameron's point is, to give folks who need to charge and not park the ability to do so, and for folks who to also encourage workplace charging for folks who are leaving their car in their car holes for up to 8 hours, to make sure that to make sure and to educate them on the types of infrastructure that they need. We do have a few EV 101 handouts and whatnot that I'll be more than willing to share as well. I'm going to stop it right there. I felt like I rambled on a little bit, and I could talk a lot more about that too.
No, that's great, Eric. Answer the question, and I know you posted your contact information in the chat box earlier, and so if anyone wants to get involved in the district's electrification transportation planning, I would encourage you to contact Eric, and as he said, he's always soliciting input. So our final question for all our panelists is, what do you think that the electric vehicle landscape looks like in 5 years? We heard from Cameron earlier, and Kendra, who asked this question. Right now, you can't buy an electric vehicle in DC, and often your dealerships discourage it. So do you think in 5 years we have widespread adoption and they're commonplace and you can charge them roadside in your office buildings everywhere, or are we not there yet?
I'm happy to kick that off. I hope that within 5 years that instead of the amount of electric vehicles that people are going to be driving, we have more folks taking Eric's buses around the district to improve that overall service and to get more people on these little doohickeys right there. Yeah, check that out. I'm honestly, if you were to look at the overall guidance of which the district is approaching it, that we really want to shift more towards mode shift. If we ultimately want to see the reductions in the amount of greenhouse gases that we have in the district by 2050 and to become carbon neutral, a lot of that is the emphasis on mode shift to shifting folks who can to make sure that they are taking different forms of transportation. So that would be my biggest hope that within 5 years that we see the overall increase of people commuting by bike or by bus or by metro to do so safely, and to increase that percentage over the years. Whether I see more adoptions, with everything, it becomes an education game. I think the person who asked Cameron the question earlier about where can you buy these electric vehicles and how can they be incentivized, I think a lot of that is just an educational aspect. And as it becomes more, as the market starts to shift more and more towards them being equal pricing between the matter, there was no longer, here's the dirty secret, most of the dealerships who do sell electric vehicles sell them actually at a loss. So as those vehicles become cheaper, I think it would be more incentivized for them, or less of a disincentive for dealerships to start selling those electric vehicles and to actually have them on the lot instead of people having to make special requests for them.
Gotcha.
I'm gonna hand it over to the other experts. Yeah.
I might just add real quick that in 5 years' time, there are a lot of projections that the automakers will begin to actually start turning similar profits what they get for polluting vehicles, and around that time, we're talking about passenger vehicles. I think the other interesting piece in 5 years' time is that as we ramp up the adoption of new electric vehicles, most electric vehicles, I think it's like 3/4 of electric vehicles, leased not owned, which means that you get a flood of used vehicles that are generally pretty low mileage. You get actually really good pricing on that. That's actually how I got my electric vehicle. And so in 5 years' time, there will probably be a rather ample supply of used electric vehicles on the market, and enable even a greater adoption by a broader set of DC residents. So that's one change that I think within that time frame. That's going to start filtering out beyond the more affluent parts of the city. And that will require, I think, the sort of accelerated build out of infrastructure to support this vehicle.
Jamie, I wanted to share, I can't speak to private vehicle use, but I think it's important to understand where the transit industry is going in 5 years, because just anecdotally and in conferences, talking with other transit properties around the country, we're in a period of time right now where many transit properties are in the pilot stage of including electric buses into their fleets. So they're kind of dipping their toe into the water. I predict that within the next 5 years, we're going to be looking at larger scale purchase of electric vehicles. I think a part of that will come from local mandates for that transition. But as the transit industry becomes more comfortable with the idea that, yes, you can have electric vehicles in the fleet, and then the battery is not going to run out of power if you plan carefully with around them. And yes, the major manufacturers do have a wide variety of offerings that can meet your needs, and that's already started. Some of the biggest names in bus transit manufacturing who typically provide diesel buses now have a full line of electric buses available, and they continue to expand. So we're going to see more of that in the next 5 years. We're going to see more cities transitioning their fleets, and I think along with that, more coordination between local transit properties where they can share the burden of installing electric infrastructure, especially on-route charging. So there are opportunities there where multiple transit properties can use the same on-route chargers and cut costs. So it's we're going to see a lot of change in the next 5 years there.
Jennifer, I will give you the last word if you want it.
Sure, thank you. And I'll give a quick word. I think we're already seeing the policies in place right now that we will get, quote unquote, there. I don't want to give another plug for Eric's transportation electrification group, but I am personally, not just from a PEPCO perspective, but as a resident of the district, really excited about it, particularly the curbside charging, as someone who's a garage orphan. So my abilities to charge are limited. So yes, I do think we'll get there. Policies are already in place and coming into place. So I'm very optimistic about the future here.
Well, thank you. And with you and all of our other panelists and other residents who also feel passionately about this, I'm confident we will get there. And thank you, everyone, for participating. The final plug of the day is to say, and thank you for our panelists. You guys did a great job, as I promised everyone you would. So thank you. I'll post this recording online soon. And our next event is the second Wednesday in February, and that'll be on solar in the district. So I would encourage you to register for that as well if you're interested. And with that, thank you and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Take care, everyone.